Picture this. You're bleeding out in a war zone, enemy fire raining down around you. And the only person who can save your life is a quiet medic who barely speaks above a whisper. You trust her with your wounds, your pain, your very survival. But what you don't know is that this same gentle woman who's carefully bandaging your injuries has a secret that could reshape the entire battlefield in a matter of minutes. What happens when the person you least expect turns out to be the most dangerous weapon in the sky? What happens when someone breaks every rule, defies every expectation, and changes the course of history while everyone around them thinks they're just doing their regular job? This is the story of Sarah Chun, a woman whose true identity remained hidden until the moment when everything went wrong, and she had to choose between keeping her secret or saving hundreds of lives. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about heroes, about war, and about the quiet people who walk among us carrying extraordinary secrets. The battlefield is about to teach everyone a lesson they'll never forget. And it all starts with a medic who wasn't really a medic at all. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Falcon in Iraq, and Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun moved through the medical tent with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown for the past 8 months. Her hands were steady as she checked supplies, her voice soft but clear as she spoke to the wounded soldiers under her care. To everyone around her, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a dedicated field medic whose gentle manner and expert care had earned her the nickname Angel among the troops. But Sarah Chun was living a lie, and every day that lie grew heavier. She had joined the army as a medic because it seemed like the perfect cover. Medical personnel were respected, trusted, and, most importantly, rarely questioned about their backgrounds or specialized training. What her fellow soldiers didn't know was that before she ever touched a bandage or administered morphine, Sarah had spent 4 years as one of the Army's most skilled helicopter pilots, specializing in Apache attack helicopters. She had logged over 800 flight hours, completed advanced combat maneuvers that most pilots only dreamed of, and earned commendations that were now buried deep in classified files. The switch from pilot to medic hadn't been her choice. It had been the result of a mission gone wrong, friendly fire that had killed 3 soldiers, and a military investigation that had cleared her of wrongdoing but left her emotionally shattered. The Army had offered her counseling, different assignments, even a promotion. Instead, she had requested a complete career change. She wanted to save lives instead of taking them, to heal instead of destroy. The military, eager to retain a valuable soldier, had agreed to retrain her as a medic. Now, 18 months later, Sarah had found a strange kind of peace in her new role. The skills were different, but equally demanding. Where once she had to make split-second decisions about targeting and weapon systems, now she made split-second decisions about trauma care and emergency medicine. The precision was the same, the pressure was the same, but the outcome was life instead of death. On this particular morning, Sarah was treating Corporal Danny Martinez, a young soldier from Texas who had stepped on an improvised explosive device during a patrol 2 days earlier. His left leg was a mess of metal fragments and damaged tissue, but he was alive, and Sarah was determined to keep him that way until the medical evacuation helicopter arrived. "How you feeling today, Danny?" she asked, checking the 4-line that delivered pain medication into his system. "Better, thanks to you, Doc," he replied, though his voice was strained. Danny always called her Doc, even though she had corrected him multiple times that she wasn't a doctor. "You got magic hands or something. Pain's not near as bad as yesterday." Sarah smiled, the same gentle smile that had comforted dozens of wounded soldiers. "Just good training and better drugs," she said, making a note on his chart. "The helicopter should be here this afternoon to take you to the hospital in Baghdad. They'll fix you up properly there." As she worked, Sarah's trained ears picked up the distant sound of rotor blades. Not the heavy thrum of a transport helicopter, but something different. Something that made her pause and listen more carefully. The sound was getting closer, but it wasn't on the flight schedule she had memorized. In a war zone, unscheduled aircraft meant trouble. She continued her work with Danny, but part of her mind was now focused on that sound. Years of flight training had taught her to identify aircraft by their acoustic signature, and this one was wrong. Too fast, too aggressive, coming from the wrong direction. She glanced toward the entrance of the medical tent, where other soldiers were beginning to notice the sound as well. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the officer in charge of base security, appeared at the tent entrance. His face was tense, and he was speaking rapidly into his radio. Sarah caught fragments of his conversation. Unknown aircraft, approaching from the north, not responding to radio calls. The sound was getting louder now, and Sarah's medical training warred with her pilot instincts. As a medic, her place was here, protecting her patients. As a pilot, she knew that unidentified aircraft in a combat zone usually meant one thing: enemy contact. "Doc, you okay?" Danny asked, noticing the change in her expression. "Fine, just listening to something," she replied, but her hands had stopped moving. The sound was almost overhead now, and she could tell by the pitch and rhythm that it was definitely a helicopter. But not one of theirs. Suddenly, the sound changed. The steady beat of rotor blades was interrupted by a different noise, the high-pitched whine of weapons systems powering up. Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew that sound intimately from her years flying Apaches. Someone was preparing to fire. "Everyone down," she shouted, throwing herself over Danny's stretcher just as the world exploded around them. The first rocket hit the command bunker, sending a column of smoke and flame into the morning sky. The second hit the vehicle depot, turning 2 Humvees into twisted metal. Sarah felt the concussion waves through the ground, felt the tent poles shaking above them. Around the base, soldiers were running for cover, shouting orders, trying to organize a defense against an attack they couldn't see coming. Sarah raised her head cautiously and saw the helicopter now, a Russian-made Hind gunship painted in irregular camouflage patterns. It was hovering about 800 meters out, just beyond the range of small arms fire, but close enough for its rockets and cannons to devastate the base. As she watched, it fired again, this time targeting the communications array. "We're sitting ducks," someone shouted from across the tent. "Where's our air support?" Lieutenant Morrison was back on his radio, and Sarah could hear the desperation in his voice. "Falcon Base to any station. We are under attack by enemy helicopter. Request immediate air support. Repeat, request immediate air support." The response that came back made Sarah's heart sink. "Falcon Base. Nearest air support is 20 minutes out. Recommend you take cover and wait for assistance." 20 minutes. Sarah looked around at the wounded soldiers in the medical tent, at Danny, whose eyes were wide with fear, at the other medics who were trying to figure out how to evacuate patients while under fire. 20 minutes was forever. The enemy helicopter could level the entire base in 20 minutes. The Hind was repositioning now, moving to a better angle for its next attack run. Sarah watched its movements with the trained eye of a pilot and realized with growing horror what it was doing. The helicopter was systematically targeting key infrastructure, communications, vehicles, weapon storage. It wasn't random destruction. This was a calculated attack designed to cripple the base's ability to defend itself or call for help. And then, the helicopter turned toward the medical tent. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The Geneva Convention protected medical facilities, but enemy combatants didn't always follow the rules. She could see the helicopter's nose cannon beginning to track in their direction. In 30 seconds, maybe less, rockets would tear through the tent and kill everyone inside. Around her, medics and wounded soldiers waited helplessly. They had no weapons that could reach the helicopter, no way to fight back, no way to run. They could only wait and hope that the pilot would respect the medical markings on the tent. But Sarah Chin wasn't helpless. She had skills that no one knew about, knowledge that she had tried to bury but had never truly forgotten. And somewhere on this base was an Apache helicopter that had been grounded for maintenance 3 days ago. The enemy helicopter was closer now, its weapons systems locked onto the medical tent. Sarah could see the pilot's helmet through the cockpit glass, could almost feel his finger tightening on the trigger. In 10 seconds, everyone in this tent would be dead, unless someone did something about it. Sarah looked at Danny, at the other wounded soldiers, at her fellow medics who had become her friends and colleagues. She thought about the oath she had taken as a medic. First, do no harm. But sometimes, she realized, preventing harm meant being willing to cause it. She made her decision. "I'll be right back," she told Danny, trying to keep her voice calm. "Where are you going?" he asked, grabbing her arm. "Doc, it's not safe out there." Sarah looked at him for a moment. This young soldier who trusted her completely, who saw her as nothing more than a gentle medic. "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes that doesn't matter." She pulled away from his grip and ran toward the tent entrance, ignoring the shouts of the other medics telling her to stay down, to wait for help, to be safe. But Sarah Chun had spent too many years being safe, and safety wasn't going to save the lives of the people she had sworn to protect. Outside the tent, the base was in chaos. Soldiers were running for cover, officers were shouting orders, and the enemy helicopter was positioning itself for what looked like a final, devastating attack. Sarah ran through the smoke and confusion, her medical bag bouncing against her hip, her mind already calculating distances and angles and possibilities. The maintenance hangar was 200 meters away. The Apache helicopter was inside, hopefully fueled and armed. But even if she could get there, even if she could get the helicopter started, she would have to reveal her secret to everyone. Her quiet life as a medic would be over. Her carefully constructed new identity would be destroyed. But as another rocket exploded behind her, sending shrapnel whistling overhead, Sarah realized that some things were more important than secrets. Some things were worth any price. She ran faster, her legs carrying her toward a confrontation she had tried to avoid for 18 months. Behind her, the enemy helicopter was beginning its attack run on the medical tent. Ahead of her was a choice that would change everything. Sarah Chun, the quiet medic who just wanted to save lives, was about to remember what it felt like to be a warrior. The maintenance hangar smelled of aviation fuel and metal polish, familiar scents that hit Sarah like a physical blow as she burst through the side door. There it was, H-64D Apache Longbow, tail number 94-0342, sitting in the center of the hangar like a sleeping predator. Even powered down, even surrounded by maintenance equipment and tool carts, the aircraft radiated lethal capability. Sarah had flown this exact model dozens of times. She knew every switch, every display, every quirk of the weapons systems. But, as she ran toward it, her hands shaking slightly, she wondered if 18 months of medical training had dulled the razor-sharp reflexes that had once made her one of the Army's best helicopter pilots. Behind her, another explosion shook the hangar. The enemy helicopter was getting closer, and she could hear the distant screams of wounded soldiers. Every second she delayed meant more death, more destruction. But rushing into the cockpit without proper preparation could kill her before she ever got off the ground. "Think like a pilot," she whispered to herself, forcing her mind back into patterns she had tried to forget. Pre-flight, startup, weapons check. Do it right or don't do it at all. The Apache looked almost ready to fly. The maintenance log showed that the mechanical work had been completed the day before, and the aircraft was simply waiting for a final inspection before returning to service. Sarah ran her hands along the fuselage, checking for obvious damage or loose panels. The aircraft felt solid, well-maintained, ready for combat. She climbed into the front seat, the pilot's position, and immediately felt the familiar embrace of the cockpit. Her hands found the controls automatically, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The helmet hanging on the side hook fit perfectly, and as she lowered the night vision monocle, the cockpit displays came alive in green and amber light. The startup sequence for an Apache helicopter was complex under normal circumstances, requiring careful coordination between pilot and co-pilot/gunner. But Sarah had trained extensively in single-pilot operations, and her fingers flew over the switches and buttons with practiced efficiency. Battery power, fuel pumps, engine start sequence. The twin turboshaft engines began to wind up with a rising whine that she could feel in her bones. Outside the hangar, she could hear soldiers shouting in alarm. The sound of an Apache starting up on a supposedly quiet base would definitely attract attention. Through the cockpit glass, she could see Lieutenant Morrison and several other officers running toward the hangar, their faces confused and angry. They had no idea who was in the helicopter or what was happening. Sarah ignored them. Her attention was focused on the weapons systems display, where row after row of indicators were coming online. 30mm chain gun with 1,200 rounds of high explosive ammunition. 16 Hellfire missiles, each capable of destroying an armored vehicle. 38 Hydra 70 rockets in 2 wing-mounted pods. More than enough firepower to deal with one enemy helicopter, if she could get airborne before it destroyed the base. The engines were at flight power now, and the rotor blades were beginning to turn. Sarah worked through the final checks with mechanical precision, even as her heart pounded with adrenaline and fear. It had been 18 months since she had flown combat, 18 months since she had been responsible for life and death decisions measured in milliseconds. But the skills were still there, buried beneath layers of medical training, but not forgotten. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at the side of the cockpit, his face red with exertion and confusion. He was shouting something, but Sarah couldn't hear him over the noise of the engines. She could see his lips forming words. "Who are you? What are you doing? Shut it down." Sarah looked at him through the cockpit glass and saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. She had worked alongside these people for 8 months. They knew her face, even behind the helmet and visor. The quiet medic who bandaged wounds and dispensed painkillers was sitting in the pilot's seat of the most advanced attack helicopter in the American inventory. Morrison's expression changed from anger to complete bewilderment. Sarah could almost hear his thoughts. This was impossible. Medics didn't fly helicopters, especially not Apache helicopters, especially not Angel, the soft-spoken woman who cried when soldiers died and worked 18-hour shifts to save lives. But there was no time for explanations. Through the hangar opening, Sarah could see the enemy helicopter lining up for another attack run, this time targeting the fuel depot. If those tanks went up, the resulting explosion would kill dozens of soldiers and level half the base. Sarah engaged the rotor brake release and felt the Apache lift slightly as the blades reached full operational speed. The aircraft was ready to fly. All she had to do was pull collective, and she would be airborne, armed, and dangerous. All she had to do was become a killer again. For a moment, she hesitated. The medical oath echoed in her mind. First, do no harm. She had spent 18 months learning to heal instead of hurt, to save instead of destroy. Taking this helicopter into combat would mean crossing a line she had sworn never to cross again. It would mean becoming the person she had tried to leave behind. But then, she heard it, the distinctive whistle of incoming rockets. The enemy pilot had decided to target the medical tent after all. Sarah's hesitation vanished. She pulled collective, and the Apache leaped into the sky like a living thing. The sensation of flight, of power, of absolute control over a machine designed for war, flooded back through her nervous system. This was what she had been born to do, what she was trained for, what she was good at. Everything else had just been hiding from the truth. She cleared the hangar at 50 feet, banking hard to the right to avoid the control tower. Below her, soldiers were pointing and shouting, their faces turned upward in amazement. None of them could believe what they were seeing. Angel, their gentle medic, was flying an Apache helicopter. Sarah pushed the aircraft to maximum speed, racing across the base toward the enemy helicopter. Through her targeting system, she could see the Hind clearly now. It was larger than an Apache, more heavily armored, but also slower and less maneuverable. In a straight fight, the Apache had every advantage except one. The element of surprise was already gone. The enemy pilot had spotted her takeoff and was turning to engage. Sarah could see the Hind's nose cannon swiveling in her direction, could see rockets being armed and targeted. This wasn't going to be an ambush. This was going to be a dogfight. Sarah armed her own weapons systems and felt the familiar weight of lethal responsibility settle onto her shoulders. The chain gun was loaded and ready. The Hellfire missiles were locked and loaded. All she had to do was acquire a target, achieve lock-on, and pull the trigger. All she had to do was kill. The two helicopters closed on each other at a combined speed of over 300 miles per hour. In 15 seconds, they would be in range of each other's weapons. In 20 seconds, one of them would be dead. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls now, all trace of nervousness gone. This was combat, and combat was where she belonged. She could feel the Apache responding to her every thought, every micro-movement of her hands and feet. The aircraft wasn't just a machine anymore. It was an extension of her will, her anger, her determination to protect the people she had sworn to serve. The enemy helicopter fired first, a stream of cannon shells that tore through the air where Sarah's Apache had been a split second earlier. But Sarah was no longer there. She had juked left and dropped altitude, using the Apache's superior agility to avoid the attack. Now she was in position for a shot of her own. The targeting computer locked onto the hind's center mass. Range, 800 meters, and closing. Probability of kill, 94%. All she had to do was squeeze the trigger. But, as her finger tightened on the firing button, Sarah caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Through the hind's cockpit glass, she could see the pilot's face. Young, male, probably not much older than Danny Martinez. Just a soldier doing his job, following orders, trying to survive in a war that neither of them had chosen. For a moment that lasted forever, Sarah hesitated. This wasn't a machine she was about to destroy. This was a person, someone with a family, with dreams, with people who loved him and were waiting for him to come home. Killing him would save the lives of American soldiers, but it would also destroy everything he was and everything he could have become. The hind pilot fired again, and this time his aim was better. Cannon shells ripped through the air inches from Sarah's cockpit, and she felt the Apache shudder as fragments of metal struck the armored fuselage. The enemy pilot wasn't hesitating. He was trying to kill her with professional efficiency. Sarah realized with sudden, crystal clarity that this was war. Not the sanitized version she had experienced as a medic, where she only saw the aftermath of violence. This was the raw, immediate reality of kill or be killed. There was no room for mercy, no time for doubt, no space for the luxury of moral contemplation. She squeezed the trigger. The 30mm chain gun fired a 3-second burst, sending 150 rounds of high explosive ammunition across the 600 meters separating the two helicopters. Sarah watched the tracers streak through the morning air like deadly fireworks, watched them impact against the hind's armored nose, watched the enemy aircraft stagger and begin to smoke. But the hind didn't go down. The pilot fought for control, pulling up and away, trailing black smoke, but still airborne. The aircraft was damaged but not destroyed, wounded but not dead. And now Sarah could see other helicopters on the horizon. Reinforcements. This wasn't a single enemy aircraft. This was the advance guard of a larger attack. The enemy formation was spread across the northern horizon like birds of prey, for helicopters flying in a loose diamond pattern about 2 kilometers apart. Through her targeting system, Sarah could identify them now. 3 more Russian-made Hinds, and what looked like a modified Mi-24 with extra armor plating and oversized weapon pods. This wasn't a random attack. This was a coordinated assault by experienced pilots flying modern equipment. Sarah ran the calculations in her head as she closed the distance between herself and the enemy formation. 5 against 1. Her Apache carried enough ammunition for perhaps 3 or 4 kills if every shot was perfect, if she never missed, if she never had to waste rounds on defensive maneuvers. But combat was never perfect, and Sarah knew she would be lucky to take down 2 enemy aircraft before they overwhelmed her. The smart tactical decision would be hit and run attacks. Strike fast, kill 1 helicopter, retreat, and reposition, repeat until either she was dead or they were all destroyed. But the base behind her didn't have time for a protracted engagement. Every minute she spent dancing around the enemy formation was another minute for them to call in reinforcements, to coordinate their assault, to find weaknesses in the base's defenses. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her instructors at flight school. She was going to charge straight into the middle of the enemy formation and fight them all at once. Apache 342 to Falcon Base, she radioed, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. I'm engaging multiple enemy aircraft. Recommend you implement base lockdown procedures and prepare for ground assault. This attack is too well coordinated to be a standalone operation. Colonel Barnes's voice came back immediately, tight with anger and confusion. Apache 342, identify yourself immediately. Who authorized this mission? Who is flying that aircraft? Sarah almost smiled. Even now, with enemy helicopters bearing down on the base, military bureaucracy demanded proper identification and authorization. Colonel, this is Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, medic attached to Bravo Company. I'm sorry I don't have time for proper channels right now. The silence that followed was almost comical. Sarah could imagine the expressions on the faces in the command center. Their medic, their quiet, gentle angel, was flying an Apache helicopter into combat against impossible odds. "Chun, you're a medic," Barnes finally responded. "You don't know how to fly helicopters." "With respect, sir, I'm learning pretty fast," Sarah replied as she armed a Hellfire missile and locked onto the lead enemy aircraft. "Request permission to engage." "Negative. Land that aircraft immediately. You're going to get yourself killed." Sarah keyed the radio one more time. "Colonel, I'm either going to save this base or die trying. Either way, you need to be ready for what comes next." She switched off the radio and focused entirely on the tactical situation. The enemy helicopters had spotted her approach and were adjusting their formation, spreading wider to avoid presenting a group target. The lead aircraft was turning to engage her directly while the others moved to flank her position. Professional, coordinated, deadly. The range closed to 3,000 meters. Sarah's targeting computer achieved lock on the lead hind and displayed firing solutions for both Hellfire missiles and the chain gun. At this range, the Hellfire would be more accurate, but would take precious seconds to reach the target. The chain gun was immediate, but required her to get much closer. Sarah chose the middle path. She fired one Hellfire missile at maximum range, then immediately broke left and dove toward the deck, using the missile's flight time to close distance on the second aircraft in the formation. The Hellfire streaked across the morning sky like a comet, its exhaust trail clearly visible to all the enemy pilots. The lead hind tried to evade, throwing chaff and flares while pulling a violent climbing turn. But Hellfire missiles were designed to kill tanks, and helicopters were much larger, slower targets. The missile impacted just behind the cockpit, and the enemy aircraft simply disintegrated in a ball of flame and falling debris. One down. For to go? But Sarah's attack had committed her to a course that put her directly between two enemy aircraft, and both of them opened fire simultaneously. Cannon shells and rockets filled the air around her Apache, some missing by inches, others striking the armored fuselage with metallic clangs that she could feel through the airframe. Sarah pulled the Apache into a spiraling dive, using every trick she could remember to avoid the incoming fire. The aircraft responded like a living thing, rolling and turning with inhuman precision. But she could see warning lights beginning to appear on her instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure dropping in the secondary system. Engine temperature rising on the number 2 turbine. Armor plating was designed to stop small arms fire, not direct hits from aircraft cannon. She leveled out at 50 feet above the desert floor, racing toward a small ridge line that would provide momentary cover. Behind her, the 4 remaining enemy helicopters were converging on her position, their pilots no longer interested in attacking the base. They wanted her dead, and they were willing to work together to make it happen. Sarah used the ridge line to break visual contact for perhaps 10 seconds, just long enough to acquire a lock on the nearest pursuing helicopter. She popped up above the ridge and fired her chain gun in a long, sustained burst, walking the tracers across the enemy aircraft's rotor disc. Helicopter rotors were delicate, precision-balanced mechanisms that could not tolerate damage. The enemy pilot fought for control as his aircraft began to vibrate violently, then gave up and auto-rotated toward the ground in what looked like a controlled crash landing. 2 down, 3 to go. But Sarah's ammunition counter showed she had used nearly half her cannon rounds, and she still had 16 Hellfire missiles that would be useless in close-range maneuvering combat. The remaining 3 enemy helicopters had learned from their companions' mistakes. Instead of pursuing Sarah into the low-altitude environment where her superior agility gave her an advantage, they were climbing to altitude and spreading out, trying to force her into the open where their superior numbers could overwhelm her. Sarah realized she was losing the tactical initiative. She was reacting to their moves instead of controlling the engagement. In a few more minutes, they would have her bracketed and trapped, taking turns to attack her from different angles while she burned fuel and ammunition trying to survive. Time to change the rules of engagement. Sarah turned the Apache directly toward the base and pushed the engines to emergency power. She wasn't retreating. She was using the base as bait. The enemy pilots would have to follow her if they wanted to complete their mission, and That would bring them into range of the base's defensive weapons. Forward operating base Falcon wasn't completely helpless. There were .50 caliber machine guns positioned around the perimeter, and Sarah had seen a Stinger missile team during her months as a medic. Not much against attack helicopters, but better than nothing. And if she could lure the enemy aircraft low enough, fast enough, the base defenders might get lucky shots. The 3 enemy helicopters took the bait, following her back toward the base at high speed. Sarah could see their weapons systems tracking her, could almost feel their targeting computers achieving lock. They were confident now, certain they had her trapped between their guns and the ground. Sarah waited until the last possible second, until she could hear the whistle of incoming rockets, then pulled the Apache into the most violent evasive maneuver she had ever attempted. She rolled the aircraft completely upside down while pulling maximum G-forces, using the Apache's negative G capability to literally fly the helicopter backwards while maintaining forward momentum. The maneuver was so unexpected, so physically impossible for most helicopters, that 2 of the enemy pilots overshot her position entirely. They found themselves flying directly over the base at low altitude, well within range of ground-based weapons. The Stinger missile team was ready. Sarah saw the smoke trail streak upward from behind the communications bunker, saw the 3rd enemy helicopter try desperately to evade. But Stinger missiles were heat seekers, and helicopter engines ran very hot. The missile impacted the aircraft's exhaust port, and the helicopter came apart in midair, pieces raining down on the desert beyond the base perimeter. 3 down, 2 to go. But Sarah's dramatic maneuver had cost her. The Apache was shuddering now, warning lights flashing across her instrument panel. Engine number 2 was running hot, hydraulic pressure was dropping, and she could feel vibration through the control stick that suggested rotor damage. The aircraft was still flyable, but not for much longer. The 2 surviving enemy helicopters had regrouped and were approaching from different directions, trying to catch her in a crossfire. Sarah could see them coordinating over their radio, timing their attack for maximum effect. In about 30 seconds, they would both be in firing position simultaneously. Sarah looked at her weapons display. 8 rounds left in the chain gun. 16 Hellfire missiles that were designed for long-range targets, not maneuvering helicopter combat. And an idea that was either brilliant or suicidal. Hellfire missiles were designed to kill tanks by diving down from above and striking the thin armor on the top of the vehicle. But they were also precision-guided weapons with sophisticated targeting systems that could be programmed for different attack profiles, including, if Sarah remembered her weapons training correctly, a direct attack mode that would make the missile fly straight at the target instead of climbing and diving. Sarah armed all 16 remaining Hellfire missiles simultaneously and locked onto both enemy helicopters. 8 missiles each. Massive overkill for helicopter targets. But she wasn't trying to be efficient. She was trying to create so much incoming ordnance that the enemy pilots would have no choice but to retreat or die. The targeting computer protested with warning alarms. Firing all missiles at once would leave the Apache completely defenseless and violate every tactical doctrine ever written. Sarah ignored the warnings and squeezed the firing trigger. 16 Hellfire missiles launched in rapid sequence, their rocket motors creating a thunderous roar that could be heard across the entire base. The missiles streaked out in 2 groups of 8, converging on the enemy helicopters from different angles. The sight was spectacular and terrifying, like watching fireworks designed by someone with unlimited access to military explosives. The enemy pilots had perhaps 3 seconds to react. Sarah watched them throw every defensive measure they had. Chaff, flares, violent evasive maneuvers. One pilot was good enough and lucky enough to avoid most of the missiles. Most, but not all. 2 Hellfires found their mark, and the helicopter disintegrated in a fireball that could be seen for miles. The last enemy helicopter, damaged but still airborne, turned and fled toward the horizon. Sarah considered pursuing, but her Apache was barely flying. Engine number 2 had seized completely. Hydraulic failure was making the controls sluggish, and she could see pieces of rotor blade flying off with each revolution. She had perhaps 2 minutes of flight time left before the aircraft became unflyable. Sarah turned toward the base and began a careful approach to the landing pad. Below her, soldiers were running out of their bunkers and defensive positions, pointing up at the sky in amazement. Some were cheering, some were just staring in disbelief. Their quiet medic had just fought and won an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. As the Apache settled onto the landing pad with grinding, mechanical protests, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion and relief that she had been suppressing during the fight. Her hands were shaking as she began the shutdown sequence, and she could taste copper in her mouth from biting her tongue during the high-G maneuvers. Through the cockpit glass, she could see Lieutenant Morrison approaching at a dead run, followed by Colonel Barnes and what looked like half the officers on the base. They all had the same expression, complete and utter bewilderment. Sarah removed her helmet and climbed out of the cockpit on unsteady legs. Her medical bag was still hanging from her shoulder, a ridiculous reminder of who she was supposed to be. Around her, the Apache was making cooling noises as the engine spun down, looking like a wounded animal that had fought beyond its limits and survived. Colonel Barnes reached her first. His face cycling through the debriefing room in the command bunker felt smaller than usual with 12 officers crowded around the metal table. Sarah sat at one end, still wearing her flight suit over medical scrubs, a combination that seemed to symbolize the impossible contradiction of her situation. Across from her, Colonel Barnes shuffled through a stack of personnel files, incident reports, and what looked like classified documents that had been hastily printed and stamped. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Barnes said, his voice carefully controlled. "For the past 8 months, I have had one of the Army's most qualified helicopter pilots working as a medic in my medical tent, and nobody thought to mention this fact to me." Sarah kept her eyes on the table. "Sir, my transfer was authorized through proper channels. My medical training was completed according to regulations. I was qualified for the position I held." "Qualified, yes. But you were also qualified for something else entirely." Barnes opened one of the files and read from it. "Flight School Honor Graduate. Advanced Helicopter Tactics Instructor. 847 combat flight hours. Commendations for valor, tactical innovation, and weapons employment excellence." He looked up at her. "You were one of our best pilots, Chun. What the hell were you doing changing bedpans?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah could feel the eyes of every officer in the room on her, all of them trying to understand how someone could walk away from being a warrior to become a healer. How someone could choose to save lives instead of taking them. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Barnes nodded. Sarah took a deep breath and told them about the mission that had changed everything. A night operation 18 months earlier, supporting ground troops who were pinned down by enemy fire in an urban area. Intelligence had been wrong about enemy positions. The coordinates had been wrong. Sarah had fired missiles at what she believed were enemy combatants and had instead killed 3 American soldiers who had taken cover in a building that wasn't supposed to be there. "The investigation cleared me," she said quietly. "Friendly fire incident due to bad intelligence. No fault assigned to flight crew. But those soldiers were dead, and I was the one who killed them." Sergeant Williams, age 22, married, new father. Corporal Johnson, age 19, wanted to be a teacher when he got out. Private First Class Adams, age 20, sending money home to support his disabled mother. The room was completely silent. Sarah could hear the air conditioning humming in the background, the distant sound of helicopters landing outside, the normal sounds of a military base going about its business. Life continuing while she talked about death. "I knew their names," she continued. "I went to their memorial services. I met their families. And I decided that I never wanted to be responsible for taking another life, even by accident, even in war, even when it was legal and authorized and tactically necessary." Major Thompson, the base operations officer, leaned forward. "So you retrained as a medic." "So I retrained as a medic. Because I wanted to save lives instead of ending them. Because I wanted to heal instead of hurt. Because I thought that maybe I could balance the scales somehow." Colonel Barnes closed the file and studied Sarah's face. "And today? What changed today?" Sarah thought about Danny Martinez lying helpless in the medical tent, about the other wounded soldiers who had trusted her to protect them, about the moment when she had realized that sometimes protecting innocent people required being willing to hurt guilty ones. Today I remembered that some things are worth fighting for, she said, and that sometimes the best way to save lives is to take them. The debriefing continued for 3 hours. Sarah answered questions about her tactical decisions during the engagement, her assessment of enemy capabilities, her recommendations for base defense improvements. The military wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how it had happened, so they could learn from it and improve their own procedures. But underneath the professional analysis, Sarah could sense a deeper current of fascination and concern. She had done something unprecedented, something that would be talked about in military circles for years. A medic who had commandeered an attack helicopter and single-handedly defeated a coordinated enemy assault. It was the kind of story that became legend, that got written up in training manuals and told to new recruits. It was also the kind of story that raised uncomfortable questions about military specialization, about hidden talents, about the assumptions people made about each other's capabilities. When the formal debriefing finally ended, Colonel Barnes asked everyone else to leave. Sarah found herself alone with the commanding officer, a man she had barely spoken to during her 8 months on the base. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been brewing too long and pushed one across the table to her. "Off the record," he said, "what you did today was extraordinary. You saved this base and probably 100 lives. You should be proud of that." Sarah sipped the bitter coffee and wondered if pride was what she was feeling. "Thank you, sir. On the record, what you did today was completely unauthorized, tactically insane, and violated about 12 different regulations." Barnes smiled slightly. "I'm going to have to write you up for unauthorized use of military equipment, failure to follow proper chain of command, and operating aircraft without current certification." "I understand, sir. I'm also going to recommend you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star, and immediate reinstatement as a rated pilot with promotion to warrant officer." Barnes leaned back in his chair. "The Army needs people who can think outside the box, Chun. Especially people who can think outside the box while flying Apache helicopters." Sarah stared at him. "Sir, I don't want to be a pilot anymore. I want to remain in medical." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Sarah thought about the 18 months she had spent as a medic, about the satisfaction of healing wounds and easing pain, about the relationships she had built with soldiers who trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. She thought about the peace she had found in a role that was about creation instead of destruction. But she also thought about today, about the feeling of absolute certainty when she had climbed into that Apache, about the knowledge that she had skills that could save lives in ways that medical training never could. She thought about the enemy helicopter that had escaped, about other attacks that might come, about other situations where being able to fight might be more important than being able to heal. "Sir, I don't know," she said honestly. 6 hours ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted to do. Now," Barnes nodded, "now you're remembering that people aren't simple, that we all carry multiple identities inside us, and sometimes circumstances force us to choose which one we need to be." "Yes, sir." "Something like that. Well, you don't have to decide today. The paperwork will take weeks to process anyway." "But, Chun." Barnes stood up, indicating the meeting was over. "Think about this. How many medics do we have on this base?" 12, sir, plus 2 doctors. "And how many people do we have who can do what you did today?" Sarah stood up as well, suddenly, understanding the weight of the choice she was facing. "Just me, sir. As far as I know, just me." "Exactly. Just you." Barnes opened the door for her. "The world is full of people who can bandage wounds, Chun. But there's only one person who can be Sarah Chun. The question you need to answer is, which version of Sarah Chun does the world need more?" Sarah walked out of the command bunker into the afternoon sun, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. Around her, the base was returning to normal operations. Soldiers were repairing damage from the morning's attack, maintenance crews were working on vehicles, and life was continuing with the steady rhythm of military routine. But things weren't really normal. Sarah could feel the difference in how people looked at her, talked to her, moved around her. Word of what had happened had spread through the base like wildfire, and she was no longer just Angel the medic. She was the medic who flew helicopters, the quiet woman who had turned out to be a warrior, the person who had revealed capabilities that nobody had suspected. She walked toward the medical tent, intending to check on her patients and try to return to her normal duties. But, as she approached, she could see Danny Martinez sitting outside on a folding chair, his injured leg propped up, talking animatedly to a group of other soldiers. He spotted her coming and waved her over. "Doc, there she is. Tell these guys what happened up there." Danny's face was bright with excitement and admiration. Sarah looked at the circle of young faces, all of them eager to hear the story firsthand from someone who had been there, who had done the impossible. These were soldiers who had signed up to fight, who understood the warrior ethos, who respected skill at arms above almost everything else. "It wasn't that complicated," she said, settling into an empty chair. "I saw a problem. I had the skills to solve it, so I solved it." "But, Doc, you're a medic." Private Jackson, one of her regular patients, shook his head in amazement. "I mean, no offense, but we all thought you were just this quiet lady who fixed people up. Nobody knew you could fly helicopters and blow stuff up." "People are complicated," Sarah said, echoing Colonel Barnes's words. "We all have different parts to ourselves. Most of the time, you only see the parts that are relevant to the situation." "But which part is the real you?" Danny asked. "The medic who takes care of us, or the pilot who saves the day?" Sarah looked at the young soldier, at his earnest face and genuine curiosity. It was a fair question, one that she had been asking herself. Which identity was more authentic? The gentle healer who had found peace in saving lives, or the warrior who had discovered that sometimes violence was the only way to protect innocence? "Maybe they're both real," she said finally. "Maybe being human means carrying contradictions inside yourself and learning when to let each part take control." The conversation continued for another hour, with soldiers asking technical questions about helicopter operations, combat tactics, and the feeling of being in a dogfight. Sarah answered as best she could, but part of her mind was elsewhere, wrestling with the decision she knew she would have to make. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah excused herself and walked to a quiet spot behind the communications bunker. She needed time to think, time to process what had happened and what it meant for her future. She thought about the enemy pilot she had killed, about the moment when she had looked into his cockpit and seen a human face before pulling the trigger. She thought about Sergeant Williams and Corporal Johnson and Private First Class Adams, the soldiers whose deaths had driven her away from combat. She thought about Danny Martinez and the other wounded soldiers in her care, people who trusted her to heal their bodies and ease their pain. 3 weeks after the attack on Forward Operating Base Falcon, Sarah Chin stood in a hangar at Ballard Air Base, staring at 2 sets of equipment laid out on separate tables. On her left was a complete flight suit, helmet, and gear for an Apache helicopter pilot. On her right was a medic's field kit, stethoscope, and the worn medical bag that had become as familiar to her as her own hands. The transfer orders in her pocket gave her a choice that was almost unprecedented in military bureaucracy. She could return to flight status as a warrant officer with an Apache squadron, or she could remain in medical service with a commendation and the promise of advanced training opportunities. The Army, in its infinite wisdom and confusion, had decided to let her choose her own path. But the real decision, Sarah knew, wasn't about career paths or military occupational specialties. It was about identity, purpose, and the kind of person she wanted to be. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of interviews, debriefings, and media attention. The story of the medic who had commandeered an Apache helicopter had reached far beyond Forward Operating Base Falcon. Military reporters wanted interviews, aviation magazines wanted technical details, and recruiting officers wanted to use her story in promotional materials. She had become, much to her discomfort, something of a celebrity within military circles. More importantly, she had become a symbol of something that people couldn't quite define. Some saw her as proof that traditional role definitions were outdated, that soldiers should be trained in multiple specialties. Others saw her as an example of individual initiative and adaptability under pressure. A few suggested that her story proved the military needed to do a better job of identifying and utilizing hidden talents. Sarah saw herself as someone who had been forced by circumstances to confront contradictions she had been trying to avoid. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Danny Martinez entered the hangar, walking with only a slight limp thanks to the surgery he had received in Baghdad. He was scheduled to return to the United States for additional rehabilitation, but he had asked to see Sarah before his departure. Still thinking about it, he asked, settling into a folding chair next to the equipment tables. Still thinking about it, Sarah confirmed. How's the leg feeling? Good. Really good. The docs in Baghdad said I'll be walking normal in another few months, maybe even running again. Danny looked at the two sets of equipment. So which way are you leaning? Sarah sat down across from him, grateful for the familiar routine of checking on a patient's progress. I honestly don't know. A month ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted to do with my life. Now I feel like I'm starting over from scratch. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Danny said. Starting over, I mean. Maybe you needed to shake things up. Maybe. But starting over is scary when you're not sure which direction to go. Danny leaned forward, his expression serious. Doc, can I tell you something? When I was laying there in that tent with my leg all messed up, bleeding and hurting and scared out of my mind, you were the reason I believed I was going to make it. Not just because you were a good medic, though you were, but because you had this calm, steady way about you that made me feel safe. Sarah nodded, remembering those difficult days when Danny's condition had been touch and go. But then, Danny continued, when that helicopter was coming for us, when I thought we were all going to die, you ran out there and did something impossible. You saved all of us. Not with bandages and medication, but with guns and missiles and flying skills that none of us knew you had. Where are you going with this, Danny? Danny smiled. I'm saying that you saved my life twice, document. Once as a medic and once as a pilot. And I'm thinking that maybe the world needs both versions of you. Before Sarah could respond, another voice spoke from the hangar entrance. He's right, you know. Sarah turned to see Colonel Barnes entering the hangar, followed by a woman in Air Force dress uniform whom Sarah didn't recognize. The woman was older, probably in her 50s, with the bearing and insignia of a senior officer. Sergeant Chun, Barnes said, I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Mitchell, Air Force Medical Service. She's here with a proposition. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward and extended her hand. Sergeant Chun, I've been following your story with great interest. I understand you're facing a difficult choice about your future. Sarah shook the offered hand, wondering what an Air Force medical officer could possibly want with her. Yes, ma'am. I'm trying to decide between flight status and medical service. What if I told you that wasn't an either-or decision? What if there was a way to do both? Sarah looked from Mitchell to Barnes and back again. I'm not sure I understand. Mitchell smiled. The Air Force is developing a new program for special operations medical support. We're looking for medics who can also pilot aircraft, specifically for situations where medical personnel need to be inserted into hostile areas or where emergency medical evacuation requires someone who can both fly and treat patients. You're talking about pilot medics. Exactly. Personnel who are fully qualified in both specialties and can function in either role as the situation demands. It's experimental, it's dangerous, and it's exactly the kind of challenge that someone with your unique background might find interesting. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. The idea was intriguing, but also terrifying. That sounds like it would require extensive training in both areas. 18 months of advanced medical training at the Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, followed by 6 months of specialized flight training with combat search and rescue operations. You would come out as a dual qualified officer with credentials that maybe a dozen people in the world would possess. Danny looked back and forth between the officers. Doc, that sounds perfect for you. You could be a medic and a pilot. It sounds complicated, Sarah said carefully. And risky. What if I can't handle both specialties at the level they would require? Colonel Barnes spoke up. Chun, 3 weeks ago you proved that you could transition from medic to combat pilot in about 30 seconds. I think you can handle 18 months of training. Sarah walked over to the equipment tables and picked up her stethoscope, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. She thought about the satisfaction of diagnosing a difficult medical condition, the relief in a patient's eyes when pain was controlled, the quiet pride of saving a life through knowledge and skill rather than firepower. Then, she picked up the pilot's helmet and felt the different but equally familiar weight of responsibility that came with flying combat aircraft. She thought about the precision required to operate complex weapons systems, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and failure, the unique satisfaction of protecting others through superior skill and technology. "Can I ask you something, Colonel Mitchell?" "Of course. Why me?" "There must be other people who have medical and flight backgrounds." Mitchell exchanged a glance with Barnes before answering. "There are a few people with dual qualifications, yes. But there's only one person who has proven capable of making the psychological transition between healer and warrior instantaneously, under combat conditions, and then back again. That's a very rare quality, Sergeant Chun. It's the difference between someone who has multiple skills and someone who can truly integrate multiple identities." Sarah set down the helmet and stethoscope, her mind racing. The offer was tempting, but it also represented a fundamental change in how she saw herself and her place in the world. For 18 months, she had worked to suppress the warrior part of her identity, to become purely a healer. The events at Forward Operating Base Falcon had proven that suppression wasn't sustainable, but that didn't necessarily mean integration was the answer either. "I need to ask you both something," Sarah said finally. "And I need honest answers." Both colonels nodded. "The night after the attack, I had nightmares about the enemy pilots I killed. Not because I regret the decision or think it was wrong, but because taking lives is something that should never become easy. If I accept this position, if I train to be equally good at healing and killing, what happens to that part of me that struggles with violence? What happens if I get too comfortable with being a warrior?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. It was, Sarah realized, the heart of her dilemma. Not whether she could do both jobs, but whether she could do both jobs without losing the essential humanity that made both worth doing. Colonel Mitchell answered first. "I think the fact that you're asking that question is exactly why you're the right person for this program. Someone who worries about becoming too comfortable with violence is someone who will never lose sight of why that violence is sometimes necessary." Danny spoke up from his chair. "Doc, when you were taking care of me, I could tell that every time you had to hurt me to help me, like when you had to clean out my wounds or give me shots, it bothered you, even when it was necessary. I think that's what made you such a good medic." Sarah looked at the young soldier, struck by his insight. "You think that caring about the cost of violence makes someone better at it?" "I think it makes someone more careful about when to use it," Danny replied. "And I think being careful about when to hurt people is probably pretty important for someone in your position." Sarah turned back to Colonel Mitchell. "What would my first assignment be?" "Afghanistan. Medical support for special operations teams conducting high-risk missions in remote areas. You would be responsible for keeping people alive in situations where traditional medical evacuation isn't possible." Mitchell paused. "It would also involve training other personnel in combat medicine and emergency flight procedures. Teaching others to do what I do. Teaching others to integrate multiple skill sets. Yes. The military is recognizing that modern conflicts require people who can adapt rapidly between different roles. You could help develop training programs that would produce more soldiers like yourself." Sarah thought about the implications. Training others to be dual qualified would mean spreading the ability to heal and fight beyond herself. It would mean creating a new type of soldier, one who could save lives and take them with equal skill. The idea was both exciting and sobering. "How long do I have to decide?" "The next class begins in 6 weeks. If you're interested, we would need to know within the next few days." Sarah nodded, her mind made up, but not yet ready to voice the decision. "Thank you for the opportunity, Colonel Mitchell. I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." After the officers left, Sarah and Danny sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun set through the open hangar doors. Finally, Danny spoke. "You've already decided, haven't you?" Sarah smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "Pretty obvious, yeah. You had that look people get when they're scared and excited at the same time. Scared and excited describes it pretty well." Sarah stood up and began gathering the equipment from both tables. "I spent 18 months trying to be just a medic, trying to suppress the pilot part of myself. Then, I spent 3 weeks thinking I should go back to being just a pilot. But maybe the answer isn't choosing one or the other. Maybe the answer is accepting that I'm both. Both the person who saves lives and the person who takes them. Both the healer and the warrior. Both the medic who cares for wounded soldiers and the pilot who protects them from harm. Sarah packed the medical equipment carefully, then picked up the flight helmet. I think I've been trying to solve the wrong problem. I was trying to figure out which part of me was real, when the real question was how to make all the parts work together. Danny struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg. So you're going to take the Air Force job? I'm going to take the Air Force job. Sarah felt a sense of certainty settling into place, a rightness that she hadn't experienced since before the friendly fire incident 18 months earlier. I'm going to learn to be the best medic pilot I can possibly be, and then I'm going to teach other people to do the same thing. And if the nightmares come back? Sarah considered the question seriously. Then I'll deal with them. Because the cost of avoiding hard choices is usually higher than the cost of making them. As they walked out of the hangar together, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with ending and everything to do with beginning. She had spent months trying to escape from one identity and weeks trying to choose between two identities. Now she was ready to create a new identity that encompassed all the parts of herself, both the gentle healer and the fierce protector. 3 months later, Second Lieutenant Sarah Chun reported for duty at the Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, ready to begin the most challenging training program the military had ever devised. She carried with her the lessons learned in a medical tent in Iraq, the skills developed in the cockpit of an Apache helicopter, and the wisdom that came from understanding that some choices were too important to leave unmade. The quiet medic who had become a warrior was now becoming something new, a healer who could fight, and a fighter who could heal. She was exactly what the world needed, even if the world didn't know it yet. In her quarters that first night, Sarah Chun unpacked 2 items and placed them side by side on her desk. A stethoscope worn smooth by months of healing hands, and a pilot's helmet marked with the symbols of aerial victories. They would stay together now, symbols of a life that refused to be divided into simple categories. Outside her window, aircraft took off and landed in the endless rhythm of military operations. Some carried weapons, some carried supplies, some carried wounded soldiers to safety. All of them carried people who had chosen to serve something larger than themselves, people who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, and some things were worth healing. Sarah Chun had found her place among them, not as a medic or a pilot, but as someone who understood that the greatest strength sometimes came from embracing contradictions rather than resolving them. She had learned that being human meant carrying multiple identities, and being exceptional meant learning when to let each identity take control. The story of the medic who took control of an Apache helicopter had become the story of the officer who refused to choose between healing and fighting. It was a story that would be told for generations, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was true. And in a world that too often demanded simple answers to complex questions, truth was the most extraordinary thing of all. Most of all, she thought about the choice between being someone who saved lives and someone who took them, between being a healer and being a warrior, between peace and violence. As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Falcon, Sarah Chun sat alone with her thoughts and tried to decide who she was going to be when the sun came up. Anger, confusion, and something that might have been grudging respect. Sergeant Chun, he said slowly, I think you and I need to have a very long conversation. Sarah nodded, suddenly, feeling very tired. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she was beginning to remember all the reasons she had stopped being a pilot in the first place. The weight of lives taken, the responsibility for decisions made in microseconds, the knowledge that she had chosen to kill instead of heal. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I suppose we do. But, before she could say anything else, Danny Martinez appeared at her elbow. The young soldier was pale and moving slowly, obviously having discharged himself from the medical tent against orders. He looked at Sarah, then at the battered Apache helicopter, then back at Sarah. Doc, he said softly, I got to ask, what the hell just happened here? Sarah Chun, medic and pilot, looked at the young soldier she had been treating just an hour earlier. How could she explain that some people carried multiple lives inside them? That sometimes circumstances forced you to choose which version of yourself to be, that the gentle hands that had bandaged his wounds were the same hands that had just destroyed 4 enemy aircraft. I did my job, she said finally. Just a different job than you thought. Sarah keyed her radio, broadcasting on all frequencies. Falcon Base, this is... She paused, realizing she didn't have a call sign for this aircraft, didn't have authorization for this mission, didn't have any official standing to be in the air at all. This is Apache 342. I've engaged the enemy helicopter. Be advised, more aircraft inbound from the north. Estimate 4 additional helicopters, range 12 kilometers, and closing. The radio exploded with voices. Officers demanding to know who was flying the Apache. Air traffic controllers trying to establish communications with an unauthorized aircraft. Colonel Barnes, the base commander, personally ordering her to land immediately. Sarah ignored them all. Her attention was focused on the tactical situation developing around her. 5 enemy helicopters in total, armed and aggressive, with the stated intention of destroying forward operating base Falcon and everyone in it. Against them, she was alone. No backup, no support, no help coming for at least 15 minutes. The odds were impossible. The smart thing to do would be to retreat, to live to fight another day, to let the base fall, and save herself. That's what any rational pilot would do. But Sarah Chun had stopped being rational the moment she ran out of the medical tent. She had stopped thinking like a medic and started thinking like a warrior. And warriors didn't retreat when people they cared about were in danger. She turned the Apache toward the incoming enemy formation and pushed the engines to maximum power. Whatever happened next, she was going to make them pay for every meter of ground, every life they threatened, every soldier they tried to harm. The quiet medic was gone. In her place was something far more dangerous, a pilot with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for.